With the literary structure of this material in mind, we're now able to delve into the original meaning of this passage. Why did Moses write this account of humanity's expulsion from God's garden? What message was he conveying to the nation of Israel as he led them toward the Promised Land? Now, to be sure, on a very basic level, Moses wrote this narrative to teach some general theological themes to the Israelites whom he led. He told them a lot about the origin and the nature and the results of sin in the world, and these were very important themes. Yet, as we saw in the previous lesson, Moses did not write his primeval history simply to inform Israel about such general historical and theological issues. Instead, like many other ancient writers, Moses wrote his primeval history to give his people practical instruction about current religious and social programs, namely, in this case, leaving Egypt and going to Canaan. To see how Moses connected the primeval Garden of Eden and Israel's conquest of Canaan, we will look at three elements of his story. First, Moses' portrait of the Garden of Eden. Second, his focus on the requirement of loyalty from Adam and Eve. And third, his depiction of the curses placed on Adam and Eve. Let's look first at Moses' description of the Garden of Eden. Moses' description of the garden is so complex that many of our modern questions about Eden will always remain unanswered. Yet it's possible for us to grasp the central concerns in Moses' presentation. As we will see, Moses described the Garden of Eden in ways that identified Eden with the Promised Land. From Moses' perspective, the land to which he was leading Israel in his day was actually the location of the primeval land called Eden. Many aspects of Genesis chapters 2 and 3 make it clear that Moses wanted Israel to connect Canaan with the land of Eden. But two features of his account are particularly important. First, the identity of Eden, and second, the holiness of Eden. Let's look first at the identity of Eden. In Genesis chapter 2, verses 10 through 14, we read these words. A river watering the garden flowed from Eden. From there, it was separated into 4 headwaters. The name of the first is the Pishon. It winds through the entire land of Havilah, where there is gold. The name of the second river is the Gihon. It winds through the entire land of Cush. The name of the third river is the Tigris. It runs along the east side of Ashur. And the fourth river is the Euphrates. Moses wrote that a single river flowed from Eden and divided into 4 headwaters. These headwaters were the Pishon, the Gihon, the Tigris, and the Euphrates rivers. One central river in Eden fed into these 4 rivers. It was their central source. Now, as we explore Moses' description here, we must always remember that many geographical changes have taken place throughout our planet's history since the beginning of the world. Even in Moses' day, there was no longer a single river which fed these 4 headwaters. The scriptures teach that this central source of water will appear only in the end of time. Yet Moses' reference to the 4 rivers which were fed by this central source gives us an approximate picture of where he believed Eden had been located. We can identify the Tigris and Euphrates mentioned in chapter 2, verse 14 with the region of modern-day Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The fact that Genesis refers to these rivers has suggested to most modern interpreters that Genesis agrees with Babylonian mythology that Eden was in the region of Mesopotamia. In the Babylonian language, Aden means a plain or an open flat land, a term well suited for the lower Tigris-Euphrates region. In Hebrew, however, Eden does not mean a plain, it means a pleasant or delightful place. So Moses was not using the Babylonian word at all. He used a Hebrew word that sounded like the Babylonian word for Eden, but his concept of this place was not the same. In fact, the account of Genesis explicitly states that Eden was not limited to Mesopotamia. As we saw in Genesis chapter 2, verse 10, the Tigris and Euphrates flowed from a greater river which was located in Eden. We read in verse 10, "A river watering the garden flowed from Eden. From there it was separated into 4 headwaters." This passage teaches that the river of Eden fed the Tigris and Euphrates, not that Eden was limited to the Tigris-Euphrates region. Moses mentioned the Tigris and Euphrates to provide a general orientation toward the easternmost extent of Eden. These great rivers in the east mark the eastern boundary of the region of Eden. This outlook is confirmed by the location of the other rivers mentioned in Genesis chapter 2. In chapter 2, verses 11 and 13, Moses mentioned another pair of rivers. He wrote that the river of Eden fed the Pishon, which winds through the Havilah, and it also fed the Gihon, which winds through the entire land of Cush. In the Old Testament, the lands of Havilah and Cush are often associated with the region of Egypt. We cannot be sure precisely how Moses understood these rivers in relation to the great river Nile, but it is safe to say that he pointed to the region of northern Egypt as the western border of Eden. So we can see, in Moses' outlook, Eden was no small place. It was a large area extending from the Tigris-Euphrates to the border of Egypt, nearly all of the region that we now call the Fertile Crescent. Within this pleasant place was a special garden, the Garden of Eden, the centerpiece of this large territory called Eden. At first, Moses' identification of Eden with the Fertile Crescent may not seem very important, but in reality it is critical to understanding the significance of Eden for Israel as Moses wrote the book of Genesis. Elsewhere in the book of Genesis, Moses referred back to Genesis chapter 2 to teach Israel that the land of Eden, the Fertile Crescent, was the land God promised to Israel, the land to which He was taking them. This perspective became especially clear when God spoke to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 18. Listen to the way God described the borders of the promised land in this passage. "On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, 'To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates.'" We see here, on the one hand, that God promised Abraham that his land would extend to the Tigris-Euphrates region, and it would also reach to the river of Egypt. Many interpreters have suggested that the river of Egypt may not refer to the Nile itself, but to a smaller river in the Sinai border region of Egypt. In all events, it is evident that this verse alludes to the geographical boundaries of Eden as they appear in Genesis chapter 2. This allusion to Genesis 2 makes it clear that Moses believed God had promised Abraham and his descendants the land that was once known as the land of Eden. From Moses' point of view, as Israel moved toward Canaan, they actually moved toward the location of the primeval land of Eden.